Good morning, evening, or night of where you are. By the time you're getting this, I'm probably either on the plane to New York or I have just arrived in New York, and I plan to spend the week of Christmas Day along with that week with my family and friends. So for that week next week, there will be nothing. But I am not leaving you all empty-handed, for I'm going to give you possibly the longest story I have ever narrated and ever edited on this channel and what little career that I have as a narrator. Now, before we get started, I would like to thank all of you for sticking with me for so long. I know I've been gone on breaks and stuff due to school, but I have my reasons for it. And I want to thank all of you, my friends, my family, the strangers that have watched me for so long. I would have never gotten this far without all of you. And as you all know, the past 2 years have been sort of rough for me. But things are looking up, things are actually getting better, and I'm getting better in my craft and editing videos as little as it is. It's getting better than it was before. So, without further ado, I give you tonight's story of tales of cosmic terror that will plague the family of this story. Please enjoy and have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and I will see you all in 2023. West Arkham. The hills rise wild, and there are valleys with deep woods that no axe has ever cut. There are dark, narrow glens where the trees slope fantastically, and when the thin Brooklyn trickles without even having caught a glint of sunlight. On a gentler slope, there are farms, ancient and rocky, with squat, moss-coated cottages brooding eternally over old New England secrets in the lee of great ledges. But they are vacant now. The wide chimneys crumble, and the shingling sides burgly precisely below low grumbled roofs. The old folks have gone away, and the foreigners do not like to live there. French Canadians have tried it, Italians have tried it, and the Poles have come and departed. It has not because of anything that could be seen or heard or handled, but it's because of something that is imagined. The place is not good for the imagination, and do not bring restful dreams at night. It must be what this keeps the foreigners away, for old Omni Pierce has never told them anything he recalls from the strange days. Ami, who has been a little weird for years, is the only one who still remains, or who ever talked about the strange days. And he dares to do this because his house is so near the open fields and the traveled roads around Arkham. There was once a road over the hills and through the valleys that ran straight from the blasted heath is now. But people ceased to use it, and a new road is laid carving far away to the south. Traces of the old one can still be found in the midst of the weeds of the returning wilderness, and some of them would doubtless linger when the half of the hollows are flooded for the new reservoir. Then the dark woods will be cut down, and the blasted heath will be slumber far below blue waters whose surface will mirror the sky and ripple in the sun. And the secrets of the strange days will be one of the deep secrets, one of the hidden lures of the old ocean, and all the mysteries of primal earth. When I went to the hills and valleys of the survey of the new reservoir, they told me the place was evil. They told me this is Arkham, and because this is a very old town full of witch legends, I thought the evil must be something which grandmas had whispered to children throughout centuries. The name Blasted Heath seems very odd and theatrical, and I wondered how it comes from the folklore of the Puritan people. Then I saw that dark westward tangle of the glens and slope for myself, and ceased to wonder at anything besides its own elder mystery. It was morning when I saw it, but shadow looked away there. The trees grew too thickly, and their trunks were too big to be any healthy New England wood. There was too much silence in the dim alley between them, and the floor was too soft with the dank moss and many of the infinite years of decay. In the open spaces, the hillside farms, sometimes with all the buildings standing, sometimes with only one or two, or sometimes with only the lone chimney or fast-falling cellar. Weeds and berry resigns, and the furtive wild things resulted in the other growths. Upon everything was a haze and restless and oppression, a touch of unreal and the grotesque, as if some vital element was perspective a weary away. I did not wonder that the foreigners would not stay, for this was not a region to sleep in. It was too much of a landscape of Salvatore Rosa, too much like some forbidden woodcut of the tales of terror. But even all this was not so bad as the blasted heath. I knew at the moment I came upon it at the bottom of the spacious valley, for no other name could fit such a thing, or any other thing could fit such a name. It was as if the poet had coined a phrase from having seen this one particular region. It must, I thought as I viewed it, by the outcome of the fire. But why had nothing new ever grown over those 5 acres of gray desolations that sprawled upon the sky like a great spot eaten by acid in the woods and fields? It lay largely on the north of the ancient road line, but encroached a little on the other side. I felt an old reluctance about approaching, and I did so at last only because my business took me through and past it. There was no vegetation of any kind in that broad expanse, but only a fine gray dust or ashes which no wind seemed to ever blow it out. The trees near it were silky and stunned, and many dead trunks stood and lay rotting at the rim. As I walked hurriedly by what I saw a trembling brick of stone in an old chimney and cellar on my right, and a yawning black maw of an abandoned well whose stagnant vapors played strange tricks with the hues of the sunlight. Even the long, dark woodland climb beyond seemed welcome in contrast, and I marveled no more as the frightened whispers of Arkham people. There had been no house or ruin near. Even in the old days, this place must have been lonely and remote. And at twilight, dreading to repress the ominous spot, I walked cautiously back to the town by the curved road on the south. I vaguely wished for some clouds would gather, for an odd activity about the deep-skied voids above had crept into my soul. In the evening I asked old people in Arkham about the blasted heath, and what was meant to be the phrase strange days, which so many evasively muttered. I could not, however, get any good answers, except that all the mystery had much more recent than I had dreamed. It was not a matter of old legends at all, but something within the lifetime of those who spoke. It had happened in the 80s, and the family disappeared or was killed. Speakers would not be exact, and because they all told me to pay no attention to old Omni Pierce's crazy tales, I sought him out the next morning, having heard that he lived alone in an ancient tottering cottage where the trees first began to get very thick. It was a fearsome empty place, and I had begun to eschew the fierce miserable odor which clings about houses that have stood for too long. Only with persistent knocking I could rouse the aged man, and when he shuffled timidly to the door I could tell he was not glad to see me. He was not feeble as I expected, but his eyes drooped in a curious way, and his unkempt clothes and white beard made him seem very worn and dismal. Not knowing just how he could have bested the launch of his tale, I feigned a matter of business, told him that my surveying, and asked vague questions about the district. He was far brighter and more educated than I had led to think, and before I knew it, he grasped quiet as much as the subject as any other man that I talked to within the Arkham. He was not like other rustics that I have known in the section where a reservoir were to be. From him there was no protest of the miles of the old woods and farmlands that had bottled out, though perhaps there would have been a not at home lane outside the bound of the future lake. Relief was all he eschewed. Relief at the doom of the dark ancient valley through which he had been roamed all his life. They were better underwater now, better underwater since the strange days. And with this, his husky voice sank low, while his body leaned forward and his right forefinger began to point shakily and impressively. It was then that I heard the story, and as a rambling voice scraped and whispered as I shivered again and again despite the summer day. Often I had to recall the speaker from rambling, pieces of scientific spots in which he'd known about a fading paired memory of professors talking, or a bridge over the gap where his sense of logic and continually broke down. When he was done, I did not wonder that his mind had snapped a trifle, or that the folks of Arkham would not speak much of the blasted heaths. I hurried back before sunset to my hotel, unwilling to have the stars come out above me in the open, and the next day returned to Boston to give up my position. I could not go into the dim chaos of Old Forest and Slope again, or face another time when the gray blasted heath where the black well yawned deep beside the trembling bricks and stones. The reservoir will soon be built now, and all those eldritch secrets will be safe forever under watery fathoms. But even then, I do not believe I would like to visit the country by night, or at least not when the sinister stars are out, and nothing could bribe me to drink the new city water of Arkham. It all began, O Omni said, with the meteorite. Before the time, there had been no wild legends of owls since the witch trials. And even then, these western woods would not fear half so much the small island in the Mascara where the devil held court beside the curious stone altars older than the Indians. They were not haunted woods, and their fantastic dusk was never terrible till the strange days. Then there had come that great non-town cloud, the string of explosions in the air, and the pillar of smoke from the valley far in the woods. And by night, all Arkham had heard of the great rock that fell out of the sky and embedded itself in the ground beside the well of the Nahum Garden family. There was a house which had stood where the blasted heath was to come, the trim white Nahum Gardener house amidst a fertile garden and orchards. Nahum had come to tell the people about the stone, and had dropped in on Omni Pierce on the way. Omni was 40 then, and all the strange things were fixed very strongly in his mind. He and his wife had gone with the 3 professors from Massachusetts University, who hastened out the next morning to see the weird visitor from the unknown stellar space, and had wondered why Nahum had called it so large the day before. It had shrunk, Nahum said, as he pointed out of the big brownish mound above the ripped earth and charred grass near the orchard well sweep in the front yard. But the wise man answered that stones do not shrink. A heat lingered persistently, and Nahum declared that it had glowed faintly in the night. The professors tried it to the geologist's hammer and found it oddly soft. It was, in truth, so soft that it's almost plastic, and they growled rather than chipped a specimen to take back to the college for testing. They took it in an old pillar barrel from Nahum's kitchen, where even a small piece refused to grow cool. On the trip back, they stopped at Omni to rest, and seemed thoughtful about Mrs. Pierce's remark on the fragment was growing smaller and burning the bottom of the pail. Truly it was not large, but perhaps they had taken less than they thought. The day after that, all this was the June of '82, and the professors had trooped out again in a great excitement. As they passed Omni's, they told him what strange things the specimen had done, and how it had faded woefully away when they put it in a glass breaker. The breaker had gone too, and the wise man talked of the strange stone affinity of silicon. It had acted quite unbelievable of the well-ordered laboratory, doing nothing at all and shewed no alkyled gas when heated on charcoal, being wholly negative to the burks in bread, and soon providing itself absolutely non-volatile at any procedural temperatures, including at the oxyhydrogen blowpipe. On an anvil, it appeared highly malleable, and in the dark into luminously was very marked. Stubbornly refusing to grow cool, it soon had a colleagues in the state of real excitement, and when upon heating before the spectroscope, it displayed shining bands unlike any unknown color of the normal spectrum. There was so much breathless talk of new elements, bizarre optical properties, and other things which puzzled men of science, or woe to say when faced by the unknown. As hot as it was, they tested the crucible with all the proper reagents. Water did nothing, hydrochloric acid was the same, nitric acid and even aqua rain merely hissed and spattered against the torrid invulnerability. Omni had difficulty in recalling all these things, but recognized some Sullivan as I mentioned them as an unusual order of use. There were omnia and soda, alcohol and ether, neuroscarbon disulfide, and a dozen others. But although the weight grew steadily less as time passed, and the fragments seemed to be slightly cooling, there was no change of the solvent of shoe that had been attacked of the substance at all. It was a metal, though beyond a doubt. It was magnetic, for one thing, and after the immersion of the acid sulfate that seemed to be a faint trace of the Western figure found in the meteoritic iron. When the cooling had grown very considerable, the testing was carried in on the glass, and it was in the glass breaker where they left all the chips made of the organic fragments during the work. The next morning, both chips and breaker were gone, without a trace, and only charred spot marked with the place of the wooden shelf where they had been. All this the professor told Ami as they paused at the door, and once more he went with them to see the stony messenger from the stars, though this time his wife did not accompany him. It had now most certainly shrunk, and even sober professors could not doubt the truth about what they saw. All around the dwindling brown lump near the well was a vacant space, except where the earth had caved in. And whereas it had been a good 7 feet across the day before, it was now scarcely 5. It was still hot, and the sage studied the surface curiously as they detached another large piece of with the hammer and chisel. They gouged deeply this time, and when they peered away at a small mass, they saw that the core of the thing was not quite homogeneous. They had uncovered what seemed to be a side of a large color globe embedded in the substance. The color, which resembles some of the brand of the meteorite's strange spectrum, was almost impossible to describe, and it was only by analogy that they could call it a color at all. Its texture was glossy, and upon tapping it, it appeared to promising both brittleness and hollowness. One of the professors gave it a smart blow with a hammer, and it burst with a nervous little pop. Nothing was emitted, and all traces of the thing vanished with the puncture. It left behind a hollow sphere of space was 3 inches across, and although it was probably the others would have discovered an enclosure substance wasted away. Conjecture was vain. Some after a futile attempt was found additional globes by drilling. The seekers left again with a new specimen, which proved, however, as baffling as the laboratory of the predecessors had been. Aside from being almost plastic, having heat, magnetism, and slightly luminously, cooling slightly and powered acid, possessing an unknown spectrum, wasting away in air, and attacking silicon compound with mutual destruction as a result. It persisted no identifying features whatsoever, and at the end of the test, the college scientists were forced to own that they could not place it. It was nothing of this earth, but a piece of a great outside, and as such dowered with outside properties and obedient to outside laws. That night there was a thunderstorm, and when the professors went out to the Nahums the next day, they met with a bitter disappointment. The stone, magnetic as it has been, must have some peculiar electrical properties, for it had drawn the lightning, as Nahum said, with a singular persistence. 6 times within the hour, the farm saw the lightning strike the furrow of the front yard, and where the storm was over, nothing remnant of but a rag pit by an ancient well swept, half cooked, with caved in earth. Digging had borne no fruit, and the scientists verified that the fact of the utter vanishment. Their failure was total, so that nothing was left to do but to go back to the laboratory and test again the disappearing fragments, left carefully cased in lead, and at the end of which nothing of value has been learned of it. When it had gone, no residue was left behind, and in time the professors felt scarcely sure that they had indeed seen the waking eyes of a cryptic vestige of the fathomless gulf outside, that lone, weird message from another universe and another realm of matter, force, and entity. As was natural, the Arkham papers made much of the incident with colleagues sponsoring, and sent reporters to talk to Nahum Gardner and his family. At least one Boston daily had also described, and Nahum quickly became kind of a local celebrity. He was a lean, genial person about 50, living with his wife and 3 sons on a pleasant farmstead in the valley. He and Omni exchanged visits frequently, as did their wives, and Omni had nothing but praise for him after all these years. He seemed slightly proud of the notice that his place had attracted, and talked about the meteorite in the succeeding weeks. That July and August was hot, and Nahum worked hard on his haying and a 10-acre spectre across Chapman's Brook, his rattling wain wearing deep ruts. His rattling wain wearing deep ruts in the shadowy lanes between. The labor tired him more than it had been other years, and he felt that age was beginning to tell on him. Then fell the time for the fruits and harvests. The pears and apples slowly ripened, and Nahum vowed that his orchard was prospering as never before. The fruit was growing to phenomenal size and unwonted gloss, and in such absence of extra barrels was ordered to handle the future crops. But with the ripening came sore disappointments. For all that gorgeous array of fruit, not one single fruit was fit to eat. Into the fine flavoring of the pears and apples had crept a stealthily bitter and sickness, so that even the smallest of bites indulged a lasting disgust. It was the same with the melons and tomatoes, and Nahum sadly saw that his entire crop was lost. Quick to connect events, he declared that the meteorite had poisoned the soil, and thanked heavens that most of the other crops were in the upland lot along the road. Winter came early, and it was very cold. Omni saw Nahum less often than usual, and observed that he had begun to look worried. The rest of his family, too, seemed to have grown taciturn, and were far from steadily of their church-goings and their attendance of the various social events of the countryside. For this reserve, or melancholy, no cause could have been found, though all the household confessed now and then to poor health and the feeling of vague disquiet. Nahum himself gave the most definite statement of anyone that has ever said he had disturbed a certain footprints in the snow. There were the usual winter prints of red squirrels, white rabbits, and foxes, but the brooding farmer professed to see something not quite right with their nature and their arrangements, but appeared to think that they were not as characteristic as the anatomy and habits of squirrels and rabbits and foxes as they ought to be. Omni listened without interest until one night when he drove past Nahum's house in his sleigh on the way back to Clark's Corners. There had been a moon, and a rabbit had run across the road, and the leaps of the rabbits were longer than either Nahum or his horse liked. The latter, indeed, had almost ran away at the brought of a firm rein. Thereafter, Omni gave Nahum's tale more respect, and wondered why the Gardner dogs seemed so cowed and quivering every morning. They had, and developed, nearly lost the spirit to bark. In February, the McGregor boys from the Meadow Hill were out shooting woodchucks, and not far from the Gardner place bagged a very peculiar specimen. The properties of his body seemed slightly altered in a weird way impossible to describe, while his face had taken on an expression which no one has ever saw in a woodchuck before. The boys were genuinely frightened and threw the thing away at once, so that only their grotesque tales had ever reached the people from the countryside. But the shining of the horses near Nahum's house had now become an acknowledged thing, and all bases of the cycle of whispers and legends were fast taking form. But the shaying of the horses near Nahum's house had now become an acknowledged thing, and all basis for the cycle of whispers, legends was fast taking form. People vowed that the snow melted faster around Nahum's than it did anywhere else, and early in March there was an odd discussion of the Potter's General Store at Clerk's Corner. Stephen Rice had driven past Gardner's in the morning and had noticed a chuck cabbage coming up through the mud by the woods across the road. Never were things of such size seen before, and they had strange colors that could not be put in any words. Their shapes were monstrous, and the horses had snorted at the odor which struck Stephen in a wholly unpredicted. That afternoon, several persons drove past to see the abnormal growth. and all agreed that plant of that kind ought to never sprout in a healthy world. The bad fruit of the fall before were freely mentioned, and it went from mouth to mouth that there was poison in Nahum's ground. Of course, it was the meteorite, and remembering how strange the men from the college had found the stone to be, several farmers spoke about the matter to them. One day they paid Nahum a visit, but having no love for wild tales and folklore were very conservative in what they inferred. The plants were certainly odd, but all chalk cabbages are more or less odd in shape and odor and hue. Perhaps some mineral elements from the stone had entered the soil, but it would soon be washed away. As for the footprints and frightened horses, of course, this was a mere country talk in which some phenomenon of the arrow wouldn't be certain to start. There was really nothing for serious men to do in cases of wild gossip, for superstitious rhetorics will say and believe anything. And so all through the strange days the professor stayed away in contempt. Only one of them, were given 2 files of dust to analyze in the police job over a year and a half later, recalled that the strange color of the chalk cabbage had been very like the one anomalous bands of light shewed by the meteorite fragments in the college spectroscope. And like the brittle glob found embedded in the stone from the abyss, the sample in this analysis case gave the same odd band at first, though later is lost to property. The tree bended prematurely around Nahum's, and at night they sway ominously in the wind. Nahum's second son, Thaddeus, a lad of 15, swore that they swayed also when there is no wind. But even the gossip would not credit this. Certainly, however, restlessness was in the air, and the entire Gardner family developed a habit of stealthily listening, though not for any sound in which they could consistently named. The listening was indeed, however, rather a product of a moment when consciousness seemed half to slip away. Unfortunately, such a moment increased week by week till it became common speech that something was wrong with the all Nahum folks. When the early sassafras came out and had another strange color, not quite like the old chalk cabbage, but plainly related to equally unknown to everyone who saw it, Nahum took some blossoms to Arkham and shewed them in the edit of the Gazette, but the dexterity did no more than write a humorous article about them, in which the dark fears of rhetoric would hell be of political ridicule. It was a mistake for Nahum to tell the solid city man about the way the great overgrown mound clock butterflies behave in consonance with the sassafras. April brought a kind of madness to the country folk, and began to disuse of the road past Nahum's, which led to the ultimate abandonment. It was the vegetation. All the orchard trees blossomed forth a strange color, and though the stony soil of the yard and adjacent pastures, there sprung up a bizarre growth which only a botanist could connect with the proper flora of the region. No wholesome color were anywhere to be seen except in the green grass and leafage, but everywhere those hectic and pessimist variant of some diseases, an underling primarily tone without a place among the known tint of earth. The Dutchman's breeches became a thing of sinister menace, and the bloodroot grew insolent in their chromatic provisions. Omni and the gardeners thought that the most of the color had sort of haunting familiarity, and decided that it remained one of the brittle globals of the meteorite. Nahum plowed and sowed of the 10-acre patch of the upland lot, but did nothing with the land around the house. He knew it would be of no use, and hoped the summer's strange growth would draw all the poison from the soil. He was prepared for almost anything now, and had grown used to the sense of something near him waiting to be heard. The shunning of his house by neighbors told on him, of course, but it told on his wife more. The boys were no better off, being at school each day, but they could not help but be frightened by the gossip. Thaddeus, an especially sensitive youth, suffered the most. In May, the insects came, and Nahum Place became a nightmare of buzzing and crawling. Most creatures seemed not quite usual in their behavior, and their nocturnal habit contradicted all former experience. The guards took a watch of night watching, in all directions at random for something. They could not tell what. It was then that they all owned that Thaddeus had been right about the trees. Miss Gardner is next to see her from the window as she watched the swallow brow of a maple against the moonlit sky. The brow surely moved, and there was no wind. It must be the sap. Strangeness had come to everything grown now. Yet it was none of the Nahum family at all who made the next discovery. Familiarity had dulled them, and what they could not see was glimpsed by a timid windmill salesman from Bolton who drove by one night in ignorance of the country legends. What he told in Arkham was giving a short paragraph in the Gazette, and it was there that all the farmers, Nahum included, saw it first. The night had been dark and the buggy lamp faint, but around the farm of the valley, which everyone knew from the account most of Nahum's, the darkness had been less thick. A dim, though distant luminosity seemed to inherit all the vegetation, grass, leaves, and blossom alike, while at one moment a detached piece of the phenomenon appeared to stir furtively in the yard near the barn. The grass had so far seemed untouched, and the cows were freely pastured at the lot near the house, but towards the end of May, the mood began to become bad. Then Nahum had the cows driven to the uplands, after which the trouble ceased. Not long after this, the change in the grass and leaves became apparent to the eye. All the vineyards were going gray, and was developing a slightly singular quality of brittleness. Omni was now the only person who ever visited the place, and his visits were becoming fewer and fewer. And when school closes, the gardeners were virtually cut off from the world, and sometimes let Omni do their errand in town. They were failing curiously both physically and mentally, and no one was surprised when the news that Miss Garner's madness stole around. It happened in June, about the anniversary of the meteorite fall, and the poor woman screamed about things in the air which she could not describe. In her raving, there was not a single specific noun, but only verbs and pronouns. Things moved and changed and fluttered, and the ears tangled in the impulses in which were not wholly sound. Something was taken away. She had begun to drain of something. Something was fastening itself on her and ought not to be. Someone must keep it off. Nothing was ever still at night. The walls and windows have shifted. Nahum did not send her to the county asylum, but let her wander around the house as long as she's harmless to herself and others. Even when her expression changes, he did nothing. But when the boys grew afraid of her, and Thaddeus nearly fainted by the way she made faces at him, he decided to keep her locked up in the attic. By July, she had ceased to speak and crawl on all fours, and before the month was over, Nahum got the mad notion that she was slightly luminescent in the dark, and he now clearly saw was the case of the nearby vegetation. It was a little before this that the horses had stampeded. Something had aroused them in the night, and their neighing and kicking at the stalls had been terrible. There seemed virtually nothing to do to calm them down, and when Nahum opened the stable doors, they all bolted out like a frightening woodland deer. It took a week to track all four, and when found they were seen to be quite useless and unmanageable. Something had snapped in their brains, and each one of them had to be shot for their own good. Nahum borrowed a horse from Omni at his haying, but found it would not approach the barn. His shade bucked and whinnied, and in the end he could do nothing but drive thee into the yard while the men used their own strength to get the very heavy wagon near enough to lay off for convenient pitchings. And all the while the vegetations were turning gray and brittle. Even the flowers whose hue had been so strange were graying now, and the fruit was coming out gray and dwarfed and tasteless, and the asters and goldenrod blooming gray and distorted, and the roses of zinni and the hollyhocks in the front yard were such blasphemous-looking things that Nahum, old boy Thaddeus, cut them down. The strangely buffed insect died about the time. Even the bees that have left their hives have taken to the woods. By September, all the vegetation was fast crumbling into a grayish powder, and Nahum feared that the trees would die before the poison was out of the soil. His wife now had spells of terrific screams, and he and the boys were in a constant state of nervous tension. They shunned people now, and when school opened, the boys did not go. But it was Omni, on one of his rare visits, who first realized that the well water was no longer good. It had an evil taste that was not exactly forded nor exactly salty, and Omni advised his friend to dig another well on high grounds to use till the soil was good again. Nahum, however, ignored the warning, for he had been the time become callous to the strange and unpleasant things. He and the boys continued to use the tainted supply, drinking it listlessly and mechanically as they ate their meager and ill-cooked meals and did their thankless and motionless chores through the aimless days. There was something of a stolid resignation about them all, and as they walked half in another world between lines and nameless guards to a certain and unfamiliar doom. Thaddeus went mad in September after the visit of the well. He had gone with the pail and had come back empty-handed, shrieking and waving his arms, and sometimes lapsing into an insane titter or a whisper about the moving colors down there. 2 in one family was pretty bad, but Nahum was very brave about it. He let the boy run about a week until he began stumbling and hurting himself, and then he shut him in the attic room across the hall from his mother's. The way they screamed at each other behind their locked doors was very terrible, especially to little Merwin, who fancies that they talked in some terrible language that was not of this earth. Merwin was getting frightfully imaginative, and his restlessness was worse when the shutting away of his brother, who had been his greatest playmate. Almost at the same time, the morality among the livestock commenced. Poultry turned grayish and died very quickly, their meats being found dry and numerous about cutting. Hogs grew inordinately fat, and then suddenly began to undergo loathsome changes which no one could explain. Their meat, of course, was useless, and Nahum was at his wit's end. No ruler veterinary would approach the place, and the city veterinary from Arkham was openly baffled. The swine began growing gray and brittle and falling pieces before they died, and their eyes and muzzles developed singular alterations. For they had never been fed from the tainted vegetation, and something struck the cows. Certain areas, or sometimes the whole body, would be uncannily shriveled or compressed, and atrocious collapse or disintegration were common. In the last stage, and the death was always the result, they would be gray and turning brittle like in which to beset the hogs. There could be no questions of poison, for all cases occurred in the locked and undisturbed barn. No bites of the prowling thing could be brought by a virus, for what living beast on earth can pass through solid obstacles? It must be only natural disease, yet what disease could reach such a result is beyond anybody's guess. When the harvest came, there was not an animal surviving on the place, for the stock and poultry were dead and the dogs had run away. These dogs, 3 in number, had all vanished one night and were never heard from again. The 5 cats had left some time before, but they were going with scarcely noticed since there seemed to be no mice, and only Miss Garner had made pets of the graceful felines. On the 19th of October, Nahum staggered into Omni's house with hideous news that death had come to poor Thaddeus in his attic room, and it had come in a way which could not be told. Nahum had dug a grave in the Rail family plot behind the farm, and had put what was left of Thaddeus. There could have been nothing from outside, from the small barren window and locked door were intact. But it was much of it had been in the barn. Omni and his wife consoled the stricken man as best they could, but shuddered as they did so. Stark terrors seemed to cling around the Garners and all they touched, and the very presence of one in the house was a breath from a region unnamed and unnameable. Omni accompanied Nahum home with the greatest reluctance, and did what he might to calm the hysterical sobbings of little Merwin. Zenas needed no calming. He had come too late to do nothing but stare into space and obey what his father told him, and Omni thought that his fate was very merciful. And now and then Merwin's screams were answered faintly from the attic, and in response to the inquiry like Nahum said that his wife was getting very feeble. When night approaches, Omni managed to get away, for not even friendship could make him stay in the spot where the faint glow of the vegetation began and the trees may or may not have swayed without wind. It was really lucky for Omni that he was not more imaginative. Even as things were, his mind was bent ever so slightly, but he had been able to connect and reflect upon all the portions around him, and he must inevitably have been turned a tonal maniac. In the twilight of the hastened home, the screams of the mad woman and the nervous child ring horribly in his ears. 3 days later, Nahum lurched into Omni's kitchen in the early morning, and in absence, as hostess stammers of a desperate tale once more. While Miss Pierce listened to the clutching fright, it was little Merwin this time. He was gone, He had gone out late at night with a lantern and pail for water, and had never come back. He'd been going to pieces for days and hardly knew what he was about. Screamed at everything, there had been a frantic shriek from the yard then, but before the father could get to the door, the boy was gone. There was no glow from the lantern that had been taken, and for the child himself, no trace. At the time, Nahum thought the lantern and pail were gone too, but when dawn came, and the man had followed back into the all-night search of the woods and the fields, he had found some very curious things near the well. There was a crushed and apparent somewhat melted mass of iron which had certainly been the lantern, while a bent pail and twisted iron hoops beside it, both half fused, seemed a hint of remnant of the pail. That was all. Nahum was past imagining. Miss Pierce was blank, and Omni, when he had reached home and heard the tale, could give no guess. Merwin was gone, and there would be no use in telling people around, who shunned all gardeners now. No use either in telling the city people of Arkham, who will laugh at everything, that it was gone and now Merwin was gone. Something was creeping and waiting to be seen and felt and heard. Nahum would go soon, and he wanted Omni to look after his wife and Zenas if they survived him. It must all be a judgment of some sort, though he could not fancy what for, since he had always walked upright in the Lord's ways, so far as he knew. For 2 weeks, Omni saw nothing of Nahum, and then worried about what might happen, he overcame his fears and paid the gardener's place a visit. There was no smoke from the great chimney, and for a moment the visitor was apprehensive of the worst. The aspect of the whole farm was shockingly grayish, withered grass and leaves on the ground, vines failing in brittle wreckage and arcing walls of gabble, and great bare trees crawling up the gray November sky with a steady marvelous which Omni could not feel had come from the stable change in the tilt of the branches. But Nahum was alive after all. He was weak and lying on the couch in a low-ceiled kitchen, but perfectly conscious and able to give simple orders to Zenas. The room was deadly cold, and as Omni visibly shivered, the host shouted huskily to Zenas for more wood. Wood indeed was sorely needed, since the carving fireplace was unlit and empty, which a cloud of soot blowing above the chills and would make it down the chimney. Presently, Nahum asked him if the extra wood made him more comfortable, and then Omni saw what had happened. The status cord was broken at last, and a hapless farmer mind is proof against more sorrow. Questioning tactfully, Omni could get no clear data on all about the missing Zenas. In the whale. He lives in the whale, was all that the clouded father would say. And then there flashed across the visitor's mind a sudden thought of the mad wife, and he changed his line to inquiry. Nabby? Why, here she is, was a surprised response to the poor Nahum, and Omni soon saw that he must search for himself. Leaving a harmless babbler on the couch, he took the keys from their nail beside the door and climbed the creaking stairs to the attic. It was very close and noisome up there, and no sound could be heard from any direction. Of the 4 doors in sight, only one was locked, and on this he tried the various keys on the ring he had taken. The 3rd key proved the right one, and after some fumbling, Omni threw open the low white door. It was quite dark inside, for the window was small and half obscured by the crude wooden bars, and Omni could see nothing at all but the wide planking floors. The stench was beyond enduring, and before proceeding further, he had to retreat to another room and return with his lungs full of breathable air. When he did enter, he saw something dark in the corner, and upon seeing it more clearly, he screamed outright. When he screamed, he thought a momentary cloud eclipsed the window, and a second later he felt something brush as if some hateful current of vapor. Strange color danced before his eyes, and had not the presented horror numbed him, he would have thought that the globus of the meteorite that geologists hammered had shattered, and on the morbid vegetation that had sprouted in the spring. As it was, he thought, only the blasphemous monstrosity which confronted him, and which all too clear he had shared as nameless fate of young Thaddeus and the livestock. But the terrible thing about this horror was that it was very slow, and precisely moved as it continued to crumble. Omni would give me no added particular of the scene, but the shape of the corner does not reappear in his tale as a moving object. There are things which cannot be mentioned, and what is done to commonly humanity is something cruelly judged by the law. I gather there is no moving things was left in the attic room, and that to leave everything capable of motion, there would have been a deed so monstrous as to damn any accountable being to eternal torment. Anyone but a solid farmer would have fainted or gone mad, but Ami walked cautiously through the low doorway and locked the accursed secret behind him. There would be Nahum to deal with now. He must be fed and tended, and removed to some place where he could be cared for. Commencing his descent to the dark stairs, Omni heard a thud below him. He had thought a scream had suddenly been choked up, and recalled nervously a clammy vapor which had brushed by him and the frightful room above. What presence had his cry and entry started up? Halted by some vague fear, he heard still further sound below. Inaudibly, there was a sort of heavy dragging, and some detestable sticky noise as some fiendish and unclear species of suction. With the associative sense gouted a feverish height, he thought accountably of what he had been seen upstairs. Good God! What eldritch dream world was this into which he had blundered? He dared move neither backwards nor forwards, but stood there trembling in the black cave of the boxed-in staircase. Every trifle of the sound burned itself into his brain. The sound and sense of dread expectancy, the darkness, the steepness of the narrow steps, and merciful heaven, the faint was unmistakably luminescent. Of all the woodwork in the sight, steps, side, exposed legs, and beams alike. There was a burst forth of frantic whinnying from the Omni horse outside, followed at once by a clutter of which hold a frenzied runaway. In another moment the horse had buggied had gone beyond earshot, leaving the frightful man in the dark stairs to guess what had sent them. But that was not all. There had been another sound out there, a sound of liquid splash. Water. It must have been from the well. He had left Hero untied near it, and the buggy wheel must have brushed a knocking of the stone. And still the pale, phosphorus glow is that distinctively ancient woodwork. God, how old this house was. Must have been built before 1670, and the gambling roof no later than 1730. A feeble scratching on the floor downstairs was sound distinctly, and Omni gripped tightened on the heavy stick that he had picked up in the attic for some purpose. Slowly nerving himself, he finished his descent and walked boldly towards the kitchen. But he did not complete the walk, because what he sought was no longer there. He had come to meet him, and it was still alive after a fashion. Whether he had crawled or rather had been dragged by any external forces, Omni could not say. But the death had been at it. Everything had happened in the last half hour, but collapse, grace, and disintegration was already far advanced. There was a horrible brittleness, and a dry fragment were scaling off. Omni could not touch it, but looked horrified into the distorted parody that had been his face. What was it, Nahum? What was it? He whispered, and the cleft, bulging lips were just able to crack out a final answer. Nothing. Nothing. The color, it burns. Cold and wet, but it burns. It lived in the well. I seen it, a kind of smoke, just like flowers last spring. The well shone at night. That Amarni and Xenis, everything alive, sucked the life out of everything. That stone. It must have come from that stone. Pez the whole place. Don't know what it wants. The sound things them men from the college dug out on the stone. They smashed it. And it was the same color. Just the same, like the flowers and plants. Must have been more of them. Seeds they growed. You seen the first time this week. Must have gone strong on Xenis. He was a big boy full of life. It beat down your mind and then gets you, burdens you up. In the whale water. You were right about that. Evil water. Zenith never came back from the whale. Can't get away. Draws you. You know something's coming, but it ain't no use. I seen time and again since Zenith was took. Wear navy on me. My head's no good. Don't know how long since I fed her. It'll get her and we ain't careful. Just the color. Her face is getting to have a color sometimes towards nights. And it burns and sucks. It comes from the place where things are the same as they are here. One of them professors said so. He was right. Look how Omni, it'll do some more. Suck the life out. But that was all. That which spoke could not speak no more, because it had completely caved in. Omni laid a tablecloth over what was left and reeled out the back door into the fields. He climbed the slope to the 10-acre pasture and stumbled home by the north road of the woods. He could not pass the well from which his horse had run away. He had looked at it through the window and had seen that no stone was missing from the rim. Then the lurching buggy had not disclosed anything after all. The splash had been something else, something which went into the well after it was done with poor Nahum. When Omni reached his house, the horse and buggy had arrived before him and threw his wife into a fit of anxiety. Reassuring her without explanation, he set out once for Arkham and notified the authorities that the Gardner family was no more. He indulged in no details, but merely told the deaths of Nahum and Nabby, that Thaddeus had already known, and mentioned that cause seemed the same strange ailment of which had killed the livestock. He also stated that Merwin and Zenith had disappeared. There was considerable questioning at the police station, and in the end, Omni was compelled to take 3 officers to the Gardner farm, together with a coroner and a medical examiner and a veterinarian who had treated the deceased animals. He went much against his will, for the afternoon was advancing and he feared the fall of night over that accursed place, but it was some comfort to have so many people with him. The 6 men drove in a Democrat wagon, following Omni's buggy and arriving in the pest-ridden farmhouse about 4 o'clock. Used as the officers were a gruesome experience, no one remained unmoved on what found in the attic and under the tablecloth on the floor below. The whole aspect of the farm was its great desolation, was terrible enough. But those crumbling objects had beyond all bounds. No one could look long at them, and even a medical examiner admitted that there was little to examine. Specimens could be analyzed, of course, so he busied himself to obtain them, and he had developed that a very puzzling aftermath occurred in the college laboratory where the 2 files of dust were finally taken. Under the spectroscope, both samples gave off an unknown spectrum, in which many of the baffled bands were precisely like those in which the strange meteorite had yielded in the previous year. Property of emitting this spectrum vanished in a month, and the dust thereafter consisted mainly of ink-like photophosphorite and carbonites. Omni could not have told the men about the well, if he had thought he meant to do anything then and there. It was getting towards sunset, and he was anxious to be away. But he could not help glancing nervously at the stone curb of the great sweep. And when the detective questioned him, he admitted that Nahum had feared something down there, so much that they never thought that he would search it for Merwin and Zenith. After that, nothing could be done but to empty the well and explore the well immediately. So Omni had to wait trembling while pail after pail of rank water was hauled up and splashed into the soaking ground outside. The men sniffed in disgust at the fluid, and towards the last held their noses against the flora they have uncovered. It was no longer a job that they had feared it would be, since the water was phenomenally low. There was no need to speak to exactly what they found. Merwin and Zenith were both there, in parts, though the vestige were mainly skeletal. There was also a small deer, and a large dog in about the same state, and a number of bones of small animals. The ooze and slime at the bottom seemed inexplicably porous and bubbling, and a man who descended into the handholds of a long pole found that he could sink the wood shaft in any depth in the mud and the floor without meeting any solid obstructs. Twilight had fallen, and the lanterns were brought from the house, Then, when it seemed that nothing further could be gained from the well, everyone went indoors and conferred in the ancient setting room while the intermittent light of the spectral half-moon played wanly on the gray desolation outside. The men were frankly nonplussed by the entire case, and could find no convincing common element that linked the strange vegetation conditions, the unknown disease of the livestock and humans, and an uncountable deaths of Merwin and Zenith in the tainted well. They had heard the common country talk, it is true, but could not believe that anything contrary of natural laws had occurred. No doubt the meteorite had poisoned the soil, but the illness of persons and animals who had eaten nothing grown on that soil was another matter. Was it the well water? Very possibly. It might be a good idea to analyze it. But what peculiar madness could have made both boys jump into the well? Their deeds were so similar, and the fragments showed that there had been nothing suffered from the gray, brittle death. But why was everything so gray and brittle? It was the coroner, seated near the window overlooked the yard, who first noticed the glow about the well. Night had fully set in, and all apparent ground seemed faintly luminescent, was more than the fitful moonbeams. But the very glow was something defiant and distinct, and appeared to shoot up from the black pit like a softened ray from the searchlight, given dull reflections in the little round pools of where the water had been emptied. It had a very weird color, and all the men clustered around the window, Omni giving a violent start. For this strange beam of ghastly miasma was to him a no unfamiliar hue. He had seen the color before, and feared to think what it might mean. He had seen it in the nasty brittle gobble of the Ostrands 2 summers ago, and had seen it in the crazy vegetations of the springtime, and had thought it had seen it in an instant in the very morning against the small barred window of that terrible attic room where nameless things had happened. It had flashed there a second, and a clammy and hateful current of vapor had brushed past him, and then poor Nahum had been taken by something of that color. He had said so at last, said it was a globe in the plants, after they had come to run away in the yard and had splashed into the well, and now that well was belching forth the night of pale insidious beam of the same demonic tint. It does credit the alertness of Omni's mind that he puzzled even to the tense moment over a point on which the essential scientific. He could not but wonder at his gleaning of the same impressions from the vapor glimpse of the daytime against the window opening in the morning sky, and for the nocturnal exhalation seemed as first mist against the black and blasted landscape. It wasn't right. It was against nature, and he thought those terrible last words of his stricken friend. It comes from the place where things ain't as they are here. One of them professors said so. All 3 horses outside, tied at a pair of shriveled saplings from by the road, were now neighing and pawing frantically. The wagon driver started for the door to do something, but Omni laid a shaking hand on the shoulder. "Don't go out there," he whispered. "There is more to this nor that we would know. Nahum said something's living in that well that sucks the life out. He said it must have grown from the round ball like one of the ones seen in the meteorite stone that fell a year ago June. Sucks and burns, he said, and it's just a cloud of color like the light out there now. That ye can handle it and can't tell what it is. Nahum thought it feed on everything living and get stronger all the time. He said he seen it last week. It must have been something from away from the skyline the man from the college last year said the meteorite stone was. The way it's made in the way is working all with no way of God's world. It's some from beyond." So the men paused indecisively, as the light from the well grew stronger and the hitched horse pawed and whinnied in increased frenzy. It was truly an awful moment. With terror in the ancient and accursed house itself, 4 monstrous sets of fragments, 2 from the house and 2 from the well, in the woodshed behind, and the shaft of unknown and unholy irradiance from the slimy depths in front. Omni had restrained the driver on impulse, forgetting how uninjured he himself was, after the calmly brushed that he could color vapor of the attic room, but perhaps it was just the well that had acted as he did. No one would ever know what abroad that night, and although the blasphemy from beyond had not far hurt anyone of the weak in mind, there is no telling of what it might have done if the last moment. And with the seemingly increasing strength and a speechlessly sign of a purpose as it soon it displayed beneath a half-clouded moonlit sky. All at once, of the detectives at the window gave a short, sharp gasp. The others looked at him, and then quickly followed his own gaze upwards to the point at which it idle straying had been suddenly arrested. There was no need for words. What he had disputed at a country gossip was disputable no longer. And it was because the thing in which every man of that party agreed and whispered later in the strange days was never talked about in Arkham. It was necessary to premise that there was no wind at that hour of the evening, or did arise not long afterwards, but there was absolutely none then. Even the dry tips of the lingering hedge mustard, gray and brightland, of the fridge of the roof of the standing Democratic wagon was unstirred. And yet amid that tense, godless calm, the high bare broad of all of the trees in the yard were moving. They were twitching morbidly and spontaneously, clawing in convulsive and impossible madness of the moonlit clouds, scratching impotently of the noxious air as if it jerked for some alien and bodiless line of leakage of something's horror, withered and struggled below the black roots. Not a man breathed for several seconds. Then a cloud of darker depth passed over the moon, and the silhouette of a clutching branches faded out momentarily. And then there was a general cry, muffled with awe, but husky and almost identical from every throat. For the terror had not faded with the silhouette, and its fearsome intents of deep darkness, to which she saw wrinkling of the treetops' height 1,000 tiny points of faint and unhallowed radiance, tipping each brow like the fire of St. Elmo or the flames that came down of the apostle's head in Pentecost. It was a monstrous constellation of unnatural light, like a glitter swarm of corpse-fed flies dancing hellish sarabands over the accursed marsh, and its color was the same nameless extrusions which Omni had come to recognize and dread. All the while the shaft of the phosphorus from the well was getting brighter and brighter, bringing to the mind of the huddle of men of the sense of doom and abnormality, and which far obstructed any image their conscious minds could form. It was no longer shining out. It was pouring out, and a shapeless stream of unplicable color left the well and seemed to flow directly into the sky. The veterinarian shivered and walked to the front door to drop the heavy extra bar across it. Omni shook no less, and had the tug of a point for a lack of a controllable voice, when he wished to draw notice of the growing luminosity of the trees. The neighing and stumbling of the horses had become utterly frightful, but not a soul of the group of the old house would have ventured forth for any earthly reward. But the moment the shining of the trees increased, while their restless branches seemed to strain more and more towards vertically, the wood of the well sweep was shining now, and precisely a policeman dumbly pointed out some wooden shed and beehive near the stone wall of the west. There was commencing of shine too, though the tethered vehicle of the visitors seemed so far unaffected. Then there was a wild commotion and columning on the road, and as Omni quenched the lamp of the better seeing of the realized that the span of frantic rays had broken their saplings and ran off with the Democratic wagon. The shock served to loosen several tongues, and embraced whispers were exchanged. "It spreads on everything organic that has been around here," muttered the medical examiner. No one replied, but the man who had been in the well gave a hint that his long pole must have stirred up something intangible. "It was awful," he added. "There was no bottom at all, just ooze and bubbles and the feeling of something lurking under there." Omni's horse still pawed and screamed definitely in the road of outside, and nearly drowned its own faint quiver as he mumbled his formless reflection. "It came from the stone. It growed down there. It got everything living. It fed itself off of mind and body. Thad and Murney, Zennis and Nabby, Nahum was the last. They all drank that water. It got strong on them. It come from beyond where things ain't like what they are here. Now it's going home." At this point, as the column of unknown color flared suddenly stronger and began to wave itself into a frantic suggestion of shape which each specter later described differently. There came from a poor, tethered hero such a sound as no man before or since ever heard from a horse. Every person in that low-pitched setting room stopped his ears, and Omni turned away from the window in horrors and nausea. Words could not convey it. When Omni looked out again, and helpless beast lay huddled inert on the moonlit ground between the splintered shaft of the buggy. That was last of the hero till they buried him next day. But the present was no time for mourning, for almost at the instant a detective slightly called attention to something terrible in the very room with them. In the absence of the lamplight, it was clear that the faint phosphorites had begun to pervade the entire apartment. It glowed on the broad blank floor and the fragment of a rag carpet, and shimmered over the sashes of a small padded window. It ran up and down the exposed corner posts, concreted about the shelf and mantel, and infected the very doors and furniture. Each minute saw it strengthen, and the last of a very plain that healthy living things must leave this house. Omni showed them to the back door and the path up through the fields of 10-acre pasture. They walked and stumbled as in a dream, and did not dare look back till the very far away in the high grounds. They were glad to the path, for they could not have gone the front way by the well. It was bad enough passing the glowing barn and sheds, and those shining orchard trees and their gnarled, fiendish contours. But thank heavens the branches did their worst twisting high up. The moon went under some very black clouds as they crossed a rusted bridge over Chapman's Brook, and it was blind groping from there in the open meadows. When they looked back towards the valley and a distant garden place at the bottom, they saw a fearsome sight. All the farm was shining with a hideous unknown blend of colors. Trees, buildings, and even such grass and herbage had not have been wholly changed to lethal gray brittleness. The broad was very strange skywards, tip of the tongue of the foul flame, and lambent tickling of the same monstrous fire were creeping about the ridge poles of the house, barn, and sheds. It was a scene from a vision of Fusiel, and over the rest of rain that wrought of luminescent amarystus, that alien and undimensional rainbow of cryptic poison from the well, seething, feeling, lapping, reaching, scuttling, straining, and meaningly bubbling in the cosmic and unrecognizable chromaticism. Then without warning, the hideous thing shot vertically up towards the sky like a rocket or a meteor, leaving behind no trail and disappearing through the rounds of curious regular holes of the clouds before any man could grasp or cry out. No watcher could ever forget that sight, and Omni stared blankly at the stars of Gasnus, Deneb twinkling above the others, but the unknown color had melted into the Milky Way. But his gaze was the next moment called swiftly to earth by the crackling in the valley. It was just that, only a wooden ripping and crackling, and not an explosion, as so many others of the party vowed. Yet the outcome was the same, for in one feverish, cataclysmic instant, there burst up from the doomed and assured farm a gleamingly eruptive cataclysm of unnatural sparks and substance, blurring the glance of the few who saw it, and sending forth the zenith of the bombarding cloudbursts of such colored and fascinating fragments as our universe must needs disown. To the quickly reclose of the vapor that followed the great mobility that had vanished, and in another second they had vanished too. Behind and below was only a darkness to which the men dared not return, and all about the mounting winds which seemed to sweep down in black, four gusts from interstellar space. It shrieked and howled, and lashed at the field of distorted woods of the mad cosmic frenzy, till soon the trembling party realized it would be no use waiting for the moon to shew what was left down there in Nahum's. Too awed even to hint theories, and 7 shaking men trudged back towards Arkham by the North Road. Omni was worse than his fellows, and begged them to see him inside his own kitchen, instead of keeping straight on to town. He did not wish to cross the nighted wind-whipped woods alone as his home on the main road. For he had an added shock that the others were spared, and was crushed forever for the brooding fear he dreaded, not even mentioning for many years to come. As the rest of the watchers of the Temperance Hill had solidly set their faces towards the road, Omni had looked back at an instant at the shadowed valley of desolation so lightly sheltered his ill-stirred friend. And from that stricken, faraway spot, he had seen something feebly rise, only to sink down again upon the place from which the great shapeless horror had shot into the sky. It was just a color, but not any color of our earth or heavens. And because Omni recognized that color and knew that this last faint remnant must still lurk down there in the well, he had never been quite right since. Omni will never go near that place again, and it's over a century now since the horror happened. But he has never been there and will be glad when the new reservoir blots it out. I shall be glad too, for I do not like the way the sunlight changes color around the mouth of the abandoned well I passed. I hope the water will always be very deep, but even so, I shall never drink it. I do not think I shall visit the Arkham country hereafter. 3 of the men who had been with Omni returned the next morning to see the ruins by daylight, but there was not any real ruins. Only the bricks of the chimney and stone of the cellar, some mineral and metallic litter here and there, and the rim of that nefarious well. Save for Omni's dead horse, which they towed away and buried, and the buggy which they shortly returned to him. Everything that had been living had gone. 5 eldritch acres of dusty gray desert remains, nor has anything ever grown there since. To this day, I sprawl open to the sky like a great spot eaten by the acid in the woods and fields, and the few who have ever dared glimpse it in spite of the rural tales have named it the Blasted Heath. The rural tales are strange. They might even be stranger if the city men and college chemists could be interested enough to analyze the water from that disgusted well, and the gray dust that no wind seemed ever to disperse. Botanists, too, ought to study the studded flora of the border of that spot, for they might shed light on the country's nation of the blight is spreading, little by little, perhaps an inch a year. People say the color of the neighbor's herbage is not quite right in the spring, and that wild things live strange prints in the light winter snow. Snow never seemed quite so heavy in the Blasted Heath as anywhere else. Horses, the few that are left in the motor age, grow skittish in the silent valley, and the hunters cannot depend on their dogs too near the splotch of grayish dust. They say the mental influence is very bad too. Numbers went scarce in the years after Nahum's taking, and always they lacked the power to get away. Then the strong-minded folks all left the region, and the only foreigners tried to live in the crumbling old homesteads. They could not stay though, and one sometimes wonder what insight beyond our own wild and weird stores of whispered magic have given them. Their dreams at night, they protest, are very horrible in the grotesque country, and surely their very look at the dark realm is enough to stir a morbid fancy. No traveler has ever escaped the sense of strangeness in those deep ravines, and artists shiver at the thick woods whose mystery is as much of a spirit as of the eye. I myself am curious about the sensation I derived from my one lone walk from Omni before he told me his tale. When twilight came, I had vaguely wished for some clouds would gather, for an odd timidity about the deep sky voids above had crept into my soul. Do not ask for my opinion. I do not know, and that is all. There was no one but Omni to question, for Arkham people will not talk about the strange days, and all 3 professors who knew about the events are all dead. There were other scientists, depend upon that. One must have fed itself and escaped, and probably there was another which was too late. No doubt it's still down that well. I know there is something wrong with the sunlight I saw above the mausoleum brick. The rustics say the blight creeps in an inch a year, so perhaps this is a kind of growth or nourishment even now. But whatever demon hatchling is in there, it must be tethered to something or else it would quickly spread. Is it fastening on the roots of those trees that claw in the air? One of the current Arkham tales is about the fat oaks that shine and move as they ought not to do at night. What is it? Only God knows. And in terms of matter, I suppose the things Omni described would be called a gas. But this gas obeyed laws that are not of our cosmos. This was no fruit of such worlds, and suns and shines on the telescope and photographs placed on our observatories. This was no breath from the skies whose motions and dimensions our astronomers measure or deem too vast to measure. It was just simply a color out of space, a frightful messenger from unformed realms of infinite beyond all nature as we know it, from realms whose mere existence stuns the brain and numbs us with the black extra-cosmic gulfs it throws upon before our frenzied eyes. I doubt very much Omni consciously lied to me, and I don't think his tale was all a freak of madness as the townfolks had forewarned. Something terrible came to the hills and valley on that meteor, and something terrible, though I know not of what proportion, still remains. I shall be glad to see the water come. Meanwhile, I hope nothing will happen to Omni. He saw so much of the thing, and the influence was so insidious. Why he never been able to move away? How clearly he recalled those dying words of Nahum's. Can't get away, dolls you. You know something ain't coming and ain't no use. Omni is such a good old man. When the reservoir gang gets up to work, I must write to the chief engineer to keep a sharp watch on him. I would hate to think of him as a gray, twisted, brittle monstrosity in which persisted more and more in my troubled sleep.